Barnaby Thistlebottom had managed to kill 17 different species of cacti in the span of 3 months, which according to most botanical experts should have been physically impossible. Yet here he stood in his backyard, staring at what used to be a perfectly healthy barrel cactus that now looked like it had been through a nuclear winter and lost badly. What the bloody hell was wrong with him? Even his neighbor's cat seemed to judge him with those yellow eyes every morning, probably thinking how any human could fail so spectacularly at the most basic life-sustaining activity known to carbon-based organisms. Barnaby adjusted his ridiculous sun hat, a floppy thing covered in cartoon vegetables that his sister had given him as a joke, and surveyed the graveyard that was supposed to be his retirement hobby. The tomatoes? Dead. The roses? Dead. The supposedly indestructible mint plant? Well, let's just say it had discovered new and innovative ways to express its mortality. He was contemplating whether setting the entire garden on fire would be considered merciful euthanasia when he heard it. A sound that wasn't quite crying, wasn't quite singing, and definitely wasn't anything that should be coming from behind his compost bin. It sounded like a piccolo being strangled by a mathematical equation. Barnaby crept around the corner, garden trowel held defensively in front of him like some sort of medieval gardening knight, when he saw her. A small figure, no taller than his knee, with skin that shimmered like oil on water and hair that moved as if it were underwater. She was sitting cross-legged next to his dead tomato plants, producing the most extraordinary noise he'd ever heard. And wherever her tears hit the ground, the already dead plants somehow managed to become more dead, which again should have been impossible. "Oh, for the love of!" Barnaby dropped his trowel with a clang that made the little creature look up at him with eyes the size of dinner plates. Are you crying on my tomatoes?" The creature, and Barnaby was fairly certain at this point that she wasn't from around here, unless local children had recently evolved the ability to make plants wilt by proximity, tilted her head and made a sound like wind chimes falling downstairs. "Right," Barnaby muttered, feeling that peculiar sensation that comes just before one's life takes a sharp left turn into complete absurdity. "This is happening. I'm talking to a glittery child who's somehow making my already dead garden more dead. Fantastic!" The little alien, because let's face it, that's what she obviously was, pointed at the deceased tomatoes and made another series of musical sounds that might have been an apology or possibly a request for directions to the nearest intergalactic bus stop. Barnaby sat down heavily on his overturned wheelbarrow, which promptly broke under his weight because, of course it did. "Listen, little person thing. I don't suppose you speak English, or at least something approaching it," she responded by pointing at him, then at the plants, then at herself, and making a sound like a synthesizer having an existential crisis. "Right, charades. Wonderful." Barnaby picked himself up from the wreckage of his wheelbarrow. "Let me guess. You're lost, you're sad, and somehow your tears are the botanical equivalent of napalm." The alien child nodded enthusiastically and clapped her hands, which created a sound like breaking crystal and caused his last surviving marigold to spontaneously combust. "Bloody hell! How are you doing that?" Barnaby rushed to stomp out the tiny fire, which was probably unnecessary since there wasn't much left of the marigold to burn. "Look, sweetie, whatever you are, you can't just wait. Are you hungry?" This seemed to be the right question, because she nodded again, and her entire body lit up like a Christmas tree. Literally, little lights were twinkling under her skin. Barnaby stood there for a moment, processing the fact that he was apparently about to feed an alien child in his backyard. This was not covered in any of his retirement planning books. "All right then," he said, surprising himself with how quickly he'd accepted this turn of events. "Let's see what we've got in the kitchen, but please try not to cry on anything else. I've already achieved the impossible by killing plants that were supposedly unkillable. I don't need you helping." The walk to his back door was an adventure in itself. Every step the little alien took seemed to affect the local plant life in ways that defied several fundamental laws of physics. His grass turned colors that didn't exist in the visible spectrum. His hedge developed what appeared to be geometric patterns, and his bird bath started humming. "This is insane!" Barnaby muttered as he opened his kitchen door, trying not to think about what his homeowner's insurance would say about alien-induced property damage. Completely, utterly, magnificently insane. Inside his kitchen, things got even stranger. The alien child seemed fascinated by everything, touching his refrigerator with one finger and causing it to play what sounded like a symphony. When she approached his microwave, it began displaying what looked like star charts. "Don't touch that!" Barnaby yelped, but it was too late. The microwave was now showing what appeared to be a three-dimensional map of local space, complete with blinking dots that probably represented planets. The alien child pointed excitedly at one of the blinking dots, then at herself, then made a sound like sad wind through cosmic-sized wind chimes. That's your home?" Barnaby asked, leaning closer to the impossible display. "And you're lost?" She nodded miserably, and the sound she made next was so heartbreaking that 3 of his houseplants immediately wilted in sympathy. "Oh, come on!" Barnaby threw his hands up in despair. Those were indoor plants. They were supposed to be safe, but looking at the little alien's face, which was remarkably expressive despite being completely inhuman, Barnaby felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was the way she seemed so small and scared, or maybe it was because she was the first being in months who didn't seem to judge his complete failure at gardening. "All right," he said, surprising himself again. "Let's figure this out. You're hungry, you're lost, and you're apparently powered by some sort of botanical destruction field. What do you eat?" She pointed at his spice rack, specifically at a small pot of basil that was, miraculously, still alive. "Herbs?" Barnaby asked. "You eat herbs?" The alien child's response was to approach the basil plant and sing to it. The sound was indescribable, like hearing the ocean through a seashell, but if the ocean was made of pure music and the seashell was tuned to frequencies that made your soul feel homesick for places you'd never been. And something incredible happened. The basil plant didn't just survive, it thrived. It grew 3 times its original size, developed leaves that shimmered with their own light, and began producing basil that smelled like it had been blessed by garden gods. "What the hell?" Barnaby stared at the transformed plant. But you were killing everything else." The alien child looked up at him with those enormous eyes and made a sound that was clearly meant to be explanatory, but sounded like a flute trying to explain quantum physics. "Right," Barnaby said slowly. "So you can make plants better. But only when you're happy, and when you're sad, you kill them." She nodded enthusiastically, then pointed at the thriving basil and made eating motions. Barnaby carefully picked a few leaves from the supernatural basil plant, half expecting them to explode or transform into butterflies or something equally impossible. Instead, they felt perfectly normal, except they smelled like the concept of summer had been concentrated into plant form. He handed them to the alien child, who accepted them with a gratitude that was visible in the way her skin stopped shimmering and settled into a warm, golden glow. She ate the basil leaves with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies, and with each bite she seemed to become more solid, more there. "Better?" Barnaby asked. She nodded and made a sound like "thank you" translated through wind chimes and distant thunder. "Good. Now, about getting you home." Barnaby turned back to his microwave, which was still displaying the impossible star map. "I don't suppose you know how to work this thing." Before she could answer, there was a sound outside like someone had dropped a small moon on his driveway. The ground shook, his windows rattled, and every car alarm in the neighborhood started going off simultaneously. "Oh, fantastic!" Barnaby rushed to his front window and peered through the curtains. "What now?" What he saw in his front yard defied description, but he was going to have to describe it anyway, because his brain insisted on processing visual information even when that information made no sense whatsoever. There was a ship. Well, calling it a ship was like calling the ocean slightly damp. It was roughly the size of his house, shaped like a flower that had been designed by someone who had only heard flowers described by someone else who had never actually seen one. And it was humming. Not the kind of humming you do while washing dishes. The kind of humming that suggests vast amounts of barely controlled energy being kept in check by technology that makes human science look like finger painting. Standing next to this impossible vessel was a being that was clearly related to the little alien child in his kitchen, but scaled up to adult proportions and radiating the kind of maternal fury that could power small suns. She was tall, elegant, and completely terrifying in the way that only worried mothers can be, regardless of species. Her skin had the same oil-on-water shimmer as the child's, but instead of golden light, she was glowing with what could only be described as weaponized concern. And she was looking directly at Barnaby's house with an expression that needed no translation across species barriers. It clearly said, "Where is my daughter, and why do I detect her energy signature coming from this primitive dwelling?" "Right," Barnaby said to himself, still staring out the window. "Time to meet the family." He turned back to the alien child, who had gone very still and was making a sound like an apology being played through a broken violin. "That's your mum, isn't it?" Barnaby asked unnecessarily. The child nodded, and the sound she made was so clearly the universal expression of "I'm in so much trouble" that Barnaby couldn't help but smile, despite the fact that there was now an angry alien mother with a spaceship parked in his driveway. "Well," he said, adjusting his ridiculous vegetable hat and checking to make sure his shirt wasn't too wrinkled for first contact with an interstellar civilization. "I suppose we'd better go explain things before she decides to disintegrate the neighborhood looking for you." The alien child made a sound that was clearly agreement, mixed with mortal terror. As they walked toward the front door, Barnaby reflected on how his retirement was turning out to be much more interesting than advertised. He'd wanted a quiet life of gardening and reading mystery novels. Instead, he was apparently about to become Earth's most unlikely alien diplomat. "Just remember," he told the alien child as he reached for the door handle, "I'm completely making this up as I go along. So if we all survive the next 10 minutes, it'll be nothing short of miraculous." "Tis." She patted his hand with one tiny finger, which somehow conveyed more confidence than he felt, and made a sound like, "Don't worry, humans are probably too weird for us to stay mad at." At least, that's what Barnaby chose to believe it meant. He opened the door and stepped out to meet his new alien neighbor, who was currently using some kind of scanning device that was making his garden gnome glow ominously. "Hello there," Barnaby called out, walking across his lawn with as much confidence as a man can muster when he's wearing a hat covered in cartoon vegetables and about to explain to an alien mother why her daughter was in his kitchen. "Lovely morning, isn't it? I'm Barnaby Thistlebottom, and I believe I have something that belongs to you." The alien mother looked up from her scanning device, fixed him with a stare that could have melted steel, and spoke. What came out was not words exactly, but meaning flowed directly into Barnaby's brain in a way that was deeply unsettling and surprisingly clear. It was like having someone install a universal translator directly into his consciousness. Except the translator had a distinctly maternal and slightly threatening accent. "Human creature," the meaning said, "you will explain immediately why my offspring's biosignature is emanating from your primitive shelter, why she appears to have been exposed to your planet's toxic atmosphere for an extended period, and why I should not simply retrieve her and file a formal complaint with your species' governing body." "Ah," said Barnaby, his brain struggling to process being spoken to telepathically by an angry alien mother. "Right? Well, first of all, I don't think we actually have a governing body that handles this sort of thing. Second, she's perfectly fine, just hungry and a bit lost. Third, I'm fairly certain this is all just a misunderstanding. The alien mother's glow intensified, which Barnaby interpreted as the interstellar equivalent of raising an eyebrow skeptically. You claim my child is fine, the meaning continued, yet my senses indicate she has been exposed to atmospheric conditions completely unsuitable for her physiology, and that she has been ingesting unknown plant matter from your biosphere. Well, yes, Barnaby admitted, but she asked for the basil. Well, pointed at it anyway, and to be honest, she improved it quite a bit. Look. He gestured toward his kitchen window, where the transformed basil plant was now visible, glowing gently and looking like it belonged in some sort of botanical paradise, rather than the kitchen of a man who couldn't keep a cactus alive. The alien mother's attention snapped to the plant, and her threatening glow suddenly shifted to something that looked more like surprise. That is, the meaning paused, as if the alien mother was struggling with concepts that didn't translate well. That is grade 7 cultivation. The plant has been enhanced to level 12 nutritional density. How is this possible? I have absolutely no idea, Barnaby said honestly. Your daughter did it. She was crying at first, which seemed to kill my already dying plants, but when she got happy and sang to the basil, it just improved, rather dramatically. Mum, at this point, the alien child peeked out from behind Barnaby's legs and made a sound like wind chimes being used to perform a very apologetic concerto. The alien mother's expression, which was remarkably readable despite being completely inhuman, went through several rapid changes. Surprise, relief, confusion, and then something that looked suspiciously like pride. Nixiel, she said, and somehow Barnaby knew this was the child's name. You achieved grade 7 cultivation, without supervision, at your age. The little alien, Nixiel, nodded enthusiastically and made excited chiming sounds while pointing at Barnaby, then at the basil plant, then at herself. She's trying to tell you that I helped, Barnaby said, though he wasn't entirely sure how he knew this. Though I can't imagine what I did. I'm possibly the worst gardener in human history. The alien mother turned her attention back to Barnaby, and her mental voice had changed tone entirely. Instead of maternal threat, it now carried something like wonder. Human creature. Barnaby Thistlebottom, you may not understand what has occurred here. Grade 7 cultivation requires not just botanical knowledge, but emotional resonance with plant consciousness. The ability to guide a young Verdanian to achieve this level of cultivation is unprecedented. I'm sorry, Barnaby said, feeling somewhat overwhelmed. But what exactly is a Verdanian, and what do you mean by plant consciousness? I am quell harmony between growing things, the alien mother replied, and Barnaby got the distinct impression that this was a shortened version of her actual name. We are Verdanians. Our species evolved in symbiosis with our planet's plant life. We are, as you might say, cosmic gardeners. Barnaby looked down at Nixiel, who was now making sounds like happy wind chimes and had begun to glow with soft golden light again. Cosmic gardeners, he repeated slowly. And you're telling me that I, a man who has killed 17 different types of cacti, somehow helped your daughter achieve advanced gardening? Not just advanced, Quell replied, and her mental voice carried what could only be described as amazement. Master-level cultivation. What she achieved should not be possible for another 50 rotations of her home star. Barnaby sat down heavily on his front steps, trying to process this information. So you're saying that the worst gardener on Earth somehow helped an alien child become some sort of botanical prodigy? The universe, Quell observed, appears to have a sense of irony. At that moment, Nixiel made an excited chittering sound and ran to Barnaby's sad, drooping roses. She began to sing again, that impossible sound like hearing music through water, and something extraordinary happened. The roses didn't just bloom. They exploded into life. Colors that didn't exist in any earthly palette burst from petals that grew to the size of dinner plates. The fragrance that filled the air was like having happiness converted directly into scent molecules, and each flower seemed to glow with its own internal light. "Bloody hell!" Barnaby jumped to his feet. What did she just do to my roses? Grade 8. Cultivation, Quell said, and her mental voice was now carrying what could only be described as parental panic. Nixiel, control yourself. You cannot simply enhance every plant you encounter. The energy expenditure alone could... But Nixiel was already moving to the next plant, and the next, and the next. Everywhere she went, Barnaby's dead and dying garden burst into impossible life. Plants grew to sizes that defied botanical logic. Colors appeared that human eyes weren't designed to process, and the air filled with fragrances that made his consciousness feel like it was being hugged by the concept of spring itself. "This is getting out of hand," Barnaby called out, chasing after the enthusiastic alien child as she transformed his backyard into something that belonged in a fever dream about paradise. Nixiel, Nixiel, you need to slow down." But she was having too much fun. Every plant she enhanced seemed to make her happier, and the happier she got, the more dramatic the transformations became. His vegetable garden was now producing tomatoes the size of basketballs that glowed like Chinese lanterns. His herb garden had become a symphony of scents that made his neighbor's dogs start howling in harmony. And his compost bin was now home to mushrooms that appeared to be having philosophical discussions in languages made of color. Nixiel! Quell's mental voice was now tinged with the kind of parental desperation that transcends species barriers. "You must stop! The energy drain on your system will cause..." The alien child suddenly swayed on her feet, her golden glow flickering like a candle in the wind. "Oh, no!" Barnaby rushed to catch her as she toppled over. "She's exhausted herself." Quell was beside them, in what appeared to be a single movement, her scanning device now making urgent beeping sounds that needed no translation. "She has overextended herself." Quell's mental voice was tight with worry. "The amount of cultivation energy she has expended would challenge an adult Verdanian. For a child her age, it is dangerous." Barnaby looked down at Nixiel, who was now making weak chirping sounds and had gone from golden glow to a very pale shimmer. "What can we do?" he asked. "How do we help her?" "She needs to rest," Quell replied, "but more importantly, she needs to be in the presence of successfully cultivated plants. The resonance will help her recover her energy." Barnaby looked around his backyard, which now resembled what would happen if a botanical garden had been designed by someone who was high on cosmic inspiration and had unlimited access to impossible colors. "Well," he said, "I think we've got that covered." Quell followed his gaze, and her mental voice carried a note of wonder. "This level of cultivation, it should take decades to achieve. How did she accomplish so much so quickly?" "I think," Barnaby said slowly, carrying the exhausted alien child toward his house, "it might have something to do with the fact that she was working with plants that were already dead. Maybe there was less resistance, or maybe she just felt sorry for them. That is..." Quell paused, as if processing a concept that didn't fit her understanding of how cultivation worked, actually quite insightful. Plants that have already surrendered to entropy would indeed offer less resistance to transformation. But the emotional component you mention, sympathy for dying vegetation, that suggests a level of empathic cultivation that is extremely rare, even among adult Verdanians. They had reached Barnaby's back door, and he carefully settled Nixiel on his kitchen couch. She was still glowing faintly, but her breathing had steadied and she seemed to be sleeping peacefully. "So what happens now?" Barnaby asked. "I mean, she's clearly fine. You found her. And my garden has been transformed into something that probably violates several laws of physics. Do you just take her home?" Quell was quiet for a long moment, and Barnaby got the impression she was thinking about something much more complex than simple child retrieval. "The situation," she finally replied, "has become complicated." "How so?" "What Nixiel has accomplished here will not go unnoticed. News of grade 8 cultivation achieved by a child her age will spread throughout the botanical sectors. There will be interest. Barnaby didn't like the way she said interest. It sounded like the kind of interest that came with paperwork and official committees and people asking uncomfortable questions. What kind of interest? The Cosmic Agricultural Council will want to study her techniques. The Interspecies Botanical Exchange will want to document the enhanced plant varieties she has created. The Universal Gardening Federation will want to understand how a primitive world produced cultivation conditions that enabled such advanced results. Ah, Barnaby said, beginning to understand. So basically, a lot of very official alien organizations are going to want to poke and prod and study everything that happened here. Precisely. And they will want to study you as well, since you appear to have been instrumental in enabling these results. Barnaby sat down heavily in his kitchen chair, looking at the sleeping alien child on his couch and the impossible garden visible through his window. This is all getting rather complicated for what started as a simple case of finding a lost child in my dead tomato plants. The universe, Quell observed again, has a complicated sense of irony. As if summoned by the word complicated, Barnaby's microwave, which was still displaying the impossible star map, began making new sounds. Not the usual microwave sounds, but something that sounded like a very polite cosmic telephone. "Is that—" Barnaby began. "Incoming communication," Quell confirmed, and her mental voice now carried a note of resignation. "Multiple communications, actually. Word travels fast in the botanical sectors." The star map display began showing new information, symbols and text in languages that Barnaby couldn't read but somehow understood, meant things like priority message and urgent botanical inquiry and interspecies agricultural emergency. "How many?" Barnaby asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. 17 separate galactic organizations have submitted formal requests for information. 3 different star systems have offered to purchase your property as a botanical research site. And Quell paused, as if checking something that was particularly absurd. The Empress of the 9th Botanical Empire has declared her intention to visit personally to meet the legendary human cultivator. Barnaby stared at the microwave, which was now displaying what appeared to be a queue of waiting messages that stretched beyond the edge of the screen. "I'm going to need more tea," he said finally. Over the next few hours, Barnaby's quiet retirement cottage became the unlikely center of what could only be described as galactic botanical diplomacy. His phone, which had apparently been upgraded by proximity to alien technology, began receiving calls from beings whose names sounded like poetry, written in plant genetics. His doorbell rang constantly as various alien delegations arrived to verify the reports of impossible cultivation achievements. And through it all, Nixiel slept peacefully on his couch, surrounded by gift baskets from civilizations he'd never heard of, filled with seeds from plants that grew on worlds whose names required 3 tongues to pronounce properly. "This is insane," Barnaby muttered as he tried to find space in his refrigerator for what appeared to be a fruit that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously. How did my quiet retirement turn into— Whatever this is? Quell, who had appointed herself as his unofficial diplomatic advisor, was currently explaining to a delegation of tree beings why they couldn't simply relocate Barnaby's entire property to their home world for study. "The human has not consented to relocation," she was saying, her mental voice now carrying the practiced patience of someone who had been having this conversation all day. "And the cultivation site appears to be specifically attuned to this planetary location." The tree beings rustled their branches in what was clearly frustration and replied in a language that sounded like wind through leaves, but somehow conveyed the meaning, "But think of the research opportunities." I know," Quell replied, "but interdimensional property theft is still illegal under Council Law 7349, even for scientific purposes." Barnaby, meanwhile, was trying to figure out what to do with a package that had arrived from something called the Mushroom Collective and appeared to be breathing. "Should I be worried about this?" he called out to Quell. "Only if it starts singing," she replied, without looking away from the tree beings. "If it sings, put it in the garden immediately. Singing mushrooms are either extremely happy or about to explode." "Wonderful!" Barnaby carried the breathing package outside and set it carefully next to his transformed roses. "Just wonderful!" As the day wore on, the situation only got more surreal. A delegation from the crystal gardens of Zerion arrived with a translator that looked like a prism having an identity crisis. 3 different species of sentient plants sent representatives to express their gratitude for Nixiel's work in advancing human-Verdanian botanical relations, and something that introduced itself as the living library of agricultural knowledge wanted to make copies of all his gardening books, despite the fact that they were clearly written by someone who had no idea what he was talking about. "This can't continue," Barnaby said to Quell during a brief lull between alien visitors. "I'm just a retired accountant who wanted to grow some tomatoes. I can't handle being the center of galactic botanical diplomacy." "The situation will calm down," Quell assured him, though her mental voice suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Once the initial excitement passes, most of the organizations will return to their normal activities. The important thing is that Nixiel's achievement has been properly documented and recognized." At that moment, Nixiel stirred on the couch, making soft, chirping sounds as she woke up. "Hello there, sleepyhead," Barnaby said gently. "How are you feeling?" She sat up slowly, looking around at the chaos of alien visitors, gift packages, and transformed garden visible through the windows. Her response was to make a sound like wind chimes being used to express complete bewilderment. "Yes," Barnaby agreed. "It's all gotten rather out of hand, hasn't it?" Nixiel nodded and made questioning sounds while pointing at the various alien delegations still milling around his property. "They're here because of what you did to my garden," Barnaby explained. "Apparently it was rather impressive by cosmic standards." She looked confused and made sounds that clearly meant, "But I was just trying to help the sad plants." "I know," Barnaby said, patting her shoulder gently. "But sometimes trying to help can have bigger consequences than we expect." Quell approached them, having finally convinced the tree beings to wait their turn like everyone else. "How is she feeling?" she asked. "Better, I think," Barnaby replied, though somewhat overwhelmed by all the attention. Nixiel made agreeing sounds, and then something that was clearly a question directed at her mother. "She wants to know if she's in trouble," Quell translated. "Are you?" Barnaby asked. "I mean, she didn't do anything wrong. She was just being kind to plants that needed help." "That," Quell replied, "is exactly the problem. What she did, the level of cultivation she achieved, the emotional resonance she displayed, the intuitive understanding of botanical needs, these are not things that children her age should be capable of. It suggests either a level of natural talent that is unprecedented or what?" Barnaby asked. "Or there is something about your planet, or specifically about this location, that amplifies Verdanian cultivation abilities in ways we do not understand." Barnaby looked around his kitchen, which was now filled with alien technology, impossible gifts, and a microwave that was apparently serving as an intergalactic communication hub. "So, what you're saying is that either your daughter is some sort of botanical prodigy, or my backyard is somehow magically enhanced for alien gardening. Those appear to be the primary hypotheses, yes." Or at that moment, the breathing package he'd placed in the garden began making happy humming sounds, and through the window they could see it had opened up into what appeared to be a small mushroom city, complete with tiny mushroom citizens going about their mushroom business. "Right," Barnaby said, watching the mushroom civilization establish itself among his roses, "because that's not at all unusual." Nixiel made excited chittering sounds and pointed at the mushroom city, clearly delighted by this development. She likes them, Quell observed unnecessarily. Of course she does, Barnaby muttered. Why wouldn't she like the sentient mushrooms that have decided to colonize my garden? But as he watched Nixiel's face light up with joy at the sight of the tiny mushroom civilization, Barnaby found himself smiling despite the complete insanity of his situation. There was something infectious about her enthusiasm, something that made even the most absurd developments seem somehow right. The doorbell rang again, and through the window Barnaby could see what appeared to be a delegation of flowers that had learned to walk. "I'll get it," he said with resignation, "but I'm definitely going to need more tea." As the weeks passed, Barnaby's life settled into a routine that could only be described as magnificently abnormal. Every morning, he would wake up to find new gifts from grateful alien civilizations scattered around his property. Not normal gifts, of course. These were things like seeds that grew into plants shaped like mathematical equations, soil that hummed lullabies to promote root growth, and fertilizer that appeared to be sentient and insisted on having philosophical discussions about the nature of growth and decay. His backyard had become what various alien agricultural authorities were calling a Class 9 botanical wonder, which apparently meant it was now considered one of the most significant cultivation sites in the local galactic cluster. The Mushroom City had expanded into a thriving interdimensional trade hub. His roses had evolved their own weather system, and his vegetable garden was producing crops that technically shouldn't exist according to several fundamental laws of physics. "This is my life now," Barnaby would mutter to himself each morning as he carefully stepped around the crystal flowers that had sprouted overnight and the small herd of creatures that looked like walking broccoli, and insisted on following him around his garden, making helpful suggestions in languages that sounded like vegetables, having debates. Nixiel had become a regular visitor, arriving each morning with her mother for what Quell called advanced cultivation training, but which looked to Barnaby like a very enthusiastic alien child playing in the most elaborate garden in the known universe. "She's gotten stronger," Quell observed one morning as they watched Nixiel coax the entire section of his lawn into growing in patterns that formed complex geometric designs. "Her control has improved dramatically." "Ah, she's a good kid," Barnaby replied, sipping his tea and trying not to think too hard about the fact that his morning routine now included monitoring an alien child's botanical education. "Quick learner, too." "That," Quell said, "is what concerns the Council." Barnaby looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "Her rate of improvement is unprecedented. What she accomplished in her first visit here would normally take years of training to achieve. What she can do now, after only a few weeks of practice in your garden, is approaching master-level cultivation. The Agricultural Council is beginning to ask questions about the source of these abilities." "What kind of questions?" Before Quell could answer, Nixiel made excited, chittering sounds and pointed toward the sky. Following her gaze, Barnaby saw what appeared to be a very large, very official-looking spaceship descending toward his property. "Ah," Quell said, and her mental voice carried a note of resignation. "Those kinds of questions." The ship landed in Barnaby's front yard with the kind of precision that suggested its pilot had done this many times before. It was sleek, imposing, and covered in symbols that somehow conveyed official galactic business in a way that transcended language barriers. The beings that emerged from the ship looked like Quell and Nixiel, but somehow more formal. They wore what appeared to be uniforms made of woven light, carried devices that hummed with barely contained authority, and moved with the purposeful stride of officials who were here to investigate something that was probably going to result in paperwork. "Greetings, quell harmony between growing things," the lead official said, and Barnaby could somehow understand her even though she was speaking in the complex musical language of the Verdanians. "I am Zix, Eternal Bloom in Ordered Gardens, Chief Inspector of the Cosmic Agricultural Council. We are here to conduct a formal assessment of the cultivation anomalies that have been reported from this location." "Inspector," Quell replied formally. We welcome the Council's interest. However, I must point out that all cultivation activities here have been conducted within established protocols. The door. Protocols, Inspector Zix replied, her mental voice carrying the kind of skepticism that came with years of investigating agricultural irregularities, do not typically result in grade 12 cultivation achievements by juveniles, nor do they explain the spontaneous generation of interdimensional botanical ecosystems. She gestured toward Barnaby's backyard, where the Mushroom City was now hosting what appeared to be a trade conference with several species of walking plants, while his roses continued to maintain their own weather system and his vegetable garden produced geometric patterns that could be seen from orbit. Furthermore, the inspector continued, our long-range sensors have detected cultivation energy signatures from this location that are registering on instruments designed to monitor planetary-scale agricultural projects. This level of output from a single small plot is concerning. Barnaby, who had been listening to this exchange while trying to process the fact that his retirement hobby had apparently become a matter of galactic security, decided it was time to speak up. Excuse me, he said, stepping forward with as much dignity as a man can muster when he's wearing gardening clothes, and his backyard has its own weather system. I'm Barnaby Thistlebottom, and this is my property. I don't suppose someone could explain to me exactly what I'm being investigated for. Inspector Zix turned her attention to him, and her mental voice carried the kind of professional courtesy that suggested she was used to dealing with confused, primitive species. Human Barnaby Thistlebottom, she said, you are not being investigated for wrongdoing. However, your property has become the site of agricultural phenomena that defy current understanding of cultivation science. The Council requires a full assessment to determine whether these phenomena represent a natural anomaly, the result of unknown technology, or something else entirely. Something else like what? Barnaby asked. Like the possibility that your species possesses innate cultivation abilities that have previously gone undetected by galactic agricultural surveys. Barnaby stared at her for a moment, then burst out laughing. Me have cultivation abilities. Inspector, I've killed 17 different types of cacti. I couldn't grow mold in a petri dish if you gave me detailed instructions and a team of microbiologists. Inspector Zix exchanged glances with her assistants, who were now scanning Barnaby with devices that made his teeth itch and caused his hair to stand on end. Human Thistlebottom, she said carefully. Our preliminary scans indicate that you are indeed generating a cultivation resonance field. It's unlike anything in our databases, but it is definitely present and definitely affecting local plant consciousness. Plant consciousness? Barnaby repeated. Plants are conscious? All plant life possesses some degree of awareness, Quell explained. Verdanian cultivation techniques work by harmonizing with this consciousness to guide growth and development. What is unusual about your resonance field is that it appears to be chaotic. Oh, chaotic? Most cultivation resonance is orderly, structured, following established patterns of growth enhancement. Your field is completely random, but somehow nurturing. It's as if you're broadcasting emotional support to plants without any technical knowledge of how to do so. Inspector Zix was now studying readings on a device that looked like a crystalline flower, having an argument with a mathematical equation. Fascinating, she said. The human appears to be generating what can only be described as enthusiastic incompetence, as a cultivation technique. The plants in his vicinity are responding to this with extraordinary growth because they feel encouraged, supported. The botanical psychological framework here is completely unprecedented. So you're saying, Barnaby said slowly, that I'm accidentally good at alien gardening because I'm so enthusiastically bad at regular gardening that the plants feel sorry for me and try harder. That, Inspector Zix replied, appears to be the most accurate scientific description of your abilities, yes. At this point, Nixiel, who had been listening to this conversation while encouraging a patch of grass to grow in the shape of fractals, made excited, chittering sounds and ran over to hug Barnaby's leg. "She agrees with the assessment," Quell translated. "She says the plants here feel happy, safe, encouraged when you're around, even when you're trying to help them and making mistakes." "Unbelievable." Barnaby threw his hands up in exasperation. "I've finally found something I'm good at, and it's being bad at the thing I was trying to be good at." Inspector Zix was now looking at her readings with the expression of someone whose entire scientific worldview was being gently but thoroughly dismantled. "The implications of this are staggering," she said. "If humans possess this natural cultivation resonance, this ability to encourage plant growth through emotional support rather than technical skill, it could revolutionize agricultural practices throughout the galaxy." "Hold on," Barnaby said, alarmed by the direction this conversation was taking. "You're not suggesting that other humans should be subjected to whatever cosmic weirdness has taken over my life, are you?" "On the contrary," Inspector Zix replied, "we would be very interested in establishing formal diplomatic relations with your species. The Cosmic Agricultural Council could offer significant benefits in exchange for human participation in interstellar cultivation projects." "What kind of benefits?" Barnaby asked suspiciously. "Advanced agricultural technology, access to seeds from plants that could solve your species' food production problems, techniques for growing crops in environments previously considered uninhabitable." Inspector Zix paused, consulting another device. "And of course formal recognition as a Class 7 agricultural species, which comes with certain galactic citizenship privileges." Barnaby looked around his property, which was now home to impossible plants, sentient mushrooms, a small delegation of walking flowers who were having a committee meeting near his shed, and what appeared to be a tree that was growing its own fruit-based transportation system. "And if I say no," he asked. "Then you say no," Inspector Zix replied simply. "The Council does not coerce participation in agricultural programs. However, I should point out that your property has already become a significant attraction for botanical tourism from 17 different star systems. Formal recognition would at least provide you with legal protections and diplomatic immunity." As if summoned by the mention of tourism, Barnaby's doorbell rang. Through his front window, he could see what appeared to be a group of beings made entirely of flowering vines, carrying what were obviously cameras and guidebooks. "Fantastic," Barnaby muttered. "Alien tourists. That's exactly what this situation needed." Nixiel made sympathetic sounds and patted his hand, which somehow made him feel better despite the complete insanity of everything happening around him. "Look," he said to Inspector Zix, "I appreciate the offer, but I'm just a retired accountant who wanted to grow some vegetables. I never asked to become whatever this is. Can't things just go back to normal?" Inspector Zix looked at him with what might have been sympathy. "Human Thistlebottom, I understand your desire for normalcy. However, you have inadvertently become the catalyst for what may be the most significant agricultural discovery in galactic history. The knowledge gained from studying your cultivation techniques could benefit billions of beings across thousands of worlds. But," she continued, "the choice is entirely yours. If you prefer, the Council can establish a protective barrier around your property and classify it as a restricted research site. You would be able to continue your normal life without interference, but the site would be preserved for future study." Barnaby considered this for a moment, watching Nixiel encourage his daisies to grow in the shape of tiny dancing figures. "And if I choose the diplomatic route," he asked, "then your property becomes an official cultural exchange garden. You receive full diplomatic protection and a very generous stipend for your services as Earth's first interstellar agricultural advisor, and humans gain access to galactic agricultural knowledge that could transform your species' relationship with food production. Plus," Quell added, "Nixiel would be able to visit regularly for continued training. She's become quite attached to this place. Nixiel nodded enthusiastically and made sounds that clearly meant, "Please, can we keep coming to the magic garden?" Barnaby looked at the alien child, whose presence had somehow turned his life upside down in the most wonderful and terrifying way possible. Then at his garden, which had become something beyond imagination. Then at the growing crowd of alien tourists who were now taking pictures of his mailbox. "This is absolutely insane," he said finally. "But I suppose insane has been working out pretty well for me lately." He turned to Inspector Zix. "What exactly would being an interstellar agricultural advisor involve?" "Primarily, you would continue doing exactly what you've been doing," she replied. "Tend your garden, interact with the plants using your natural cultivation resonance, and allow researchers to study the results. Occasionally you might be asked to consult on agricultural projects for other worlds, but only if you were willing. And the aliens? I mean the beings from other worlds. They would keep visiting? This site has become something of a pilgrimage destination for agricultural enthusiasts," Inspector Zix admitted. "However, with formal recognition, we could establish proper visitor management protocols. No more unexpected arrivals, scheduled tours only, and definitely no unauthorized landing in your front yard." Barnaby looked at the official ship that was currently occupying his driveway and raised an eyebrow. "Present company accepted, of course," Inspector Zix added hastily. At that moment, his microwave, which had apparently become the unofficial headquarters for interstellar agricultural communications, began playing what sounded like a triumphant fanfare. The star map display was now showing celebrations taking place on dozens of different worlds, complete with fireworks that appeared to be made of living light and festivals where the participants seemed to be made entirely of vegetables. "What's all that about?" Barnaby asked. Quell consulted her scanning device. "News of the Council's visit has spread. The agricultural communities of 17 star systems are celebrating the potential formal recognition of human cultivation abilities." "They're throwing parties about my gardening?" Barnaby asked incredulously. "Your terrible gardening that somehow makes plants incredibly happy," Inspector Zix corrected. "It's a very specific skill set, but apparently one that resonates throughout the galaxy." Nixiel made excited, chittering sounds and pointed at the microwave display, where one of the celebrations appeared to feature enormous vegetables dancing to music made of photosynthesis. "She wants to know if we can visit some of the celebrations," Quell translated. "Visit other planets?" Barnaby asked, feeling slightly faint. "To look at alien gardens?" "Only if you're interested," Inspector Zix assured him. "Though I should mention that several worlds have already issued formal invitations. The crystal gardens of Zerion are particularly eager to show you their prismatic flower arrangements, and the living forests of Bendara have composed a welcome song in your honor." Barnaby sat down heavily on his front steps, trying to process the fact that he was apparently famous on planets he'd never heard of for being bad at something he'd never been good at. "This is all completely mad," he said finally. "Yes," agreed Inspector Zix, "but it's a very productive form of madness. The universe could use more of it." Nixiel came over and sat next to him on the steps, making soft, comforting sounds while encouraging the moss between the bricks to grow in patterns that spelled out "friend" in 17 different languages. "What do you think?" Barnaby asked her. "Should I become an official galactic gardener?" Her response was to hug his arm and make sounds that clearly meant, "Yes, please, please, please." Barnaby looked around his property one more time, at the impossible garden, the mushroom city, the visiting aliens, the walking flowers having their committee meeting, and the tree that was apparently now offering rides to small creatures in its fruit-based transport pods. "Right," he said to Inspector Zix. "I accept, but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, no more unannounced visitors. I don't care if they're the emperor of the vegetable galaxy. They make an appointment or they don't get in." "Agreed." "Second, I keep my regular tea time. 4 o'clock every day, no exceptions. I don't care if the universe is ending. I'm having my tea." Understood. Third, someone needs to explain to me how my microwave became a cosmic communication device because I'd quite like to heat up my lunch occasionally. Or we can install a separate communication array, Inspector Zix assured him. And finally, Barnaby said, looking down at Nixiel, who was now making patterns in the dirt with her finger that seemed to be teaching the earthworms basic mathematics. This little one gets to visit whenever she wants. She's turned my disaster of a garden into something magnificent, and I'd like her to see it grow. Nixiel made a sound like pure joy expressed through wind chimes, and every flower in the garden bloomed simultaneously. I think, Inspector Zix said, watching the spontaneous flowering display, that can be arranged. And so, Barnaby Thistlebottom, the worst gardener in human history, officially became Earth's first interstellar agricultural advisor and the unlikely custodian of what was now being called the most important cultivation site in the local galactic cluster. His daily routine changed remarkably little, all things considered. He still woke up every morning, put on his ridiculous vegetable hat, and went out to tend his garden. The difference was that now his garden tended back. The plants grew in impossible ways that delighted visitors from across the galaxy, and every day brought gifts from grateful civilizations whose agricultural problems had been solved by techniques derived from studying his enthusiastic incompetence. The Mushroom City had established formal diplomatic relations with 3 neighboring star systems, and was now hosting the annual Interdimensional Fungi Trade Conference. His roses had evolved to the point where they were conducting their own weather and occasionally composing symphonies that could be heard on the radio if you tuned to the right frequency. And his vegetable garden had become sentient enough to argue with him about proper watering schedules. "This is still completely insane," Barnaby would mutter to himself each morning as he stepped carefully around the crystal flowers and nodded politely to the committee of walking broccoli that had taken up permanent residence near his shed. But it was the good kind of insane, the kind that made him wake up each morning curious about what impossible thing would happen next. The kind that had brought him Nixiel, who visited every day and had become something like the granddaughter he'd never had, if granddaughters typically glowed with their own light and could make plants grow by singing to them. Besides, he would add, watching Nixiel teach his daisies to arrange themselves into geometric patterns while humming songs that made the air itself seem to sparkle. If you're going to have your life turned completely upside down by cosmic forces beyond your control, you might as well enjoy the ride. And every evening, at exactly 4 o'clock, Barnaby would sit on his back steps with his tea, surrounded by impossible plants and alien visitors and the gentle chaos of a garden that had become a bridge between worlds, and think that retirement was turning out to be much more interesting than he'd ever imagined. The universe, as Quell had observed, had a sense of irony. But it also, Barnaby had discovered, had a sense of humor, a talent for unexpected friendships, and a remarkable ability to turn disasters into miracles when you weren't paying attention. Not bad, really, for a man who'd only wanted to grow some tomatoes.